You're ready? I think we're ready. Good afternoon. My name is Derek Olson, and I'm the president of WorldOregon. On behalf of the World Affairs Councils of America, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar with Outright Action International, a special program during Pride Month and diving into the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact on the LGBTIQ communities. We have a really rich panel of experts here today. And a special note that this is done in partnership with our great friends at the World Affairs Council in Seattle, as well as World Affairs Council Pittsburgh, and our umbrella organization that links World Affairs Councils throughout the United States, the World Affairs Councils of America. This is a series of webinars that we've all been doing online in different platforms, and we thank you for bearing with us. If you've not been in on one of these before, they're a little bit different being on one in person. Instead of questions over a microphone, you can ask questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can also keep an eye on the chat function where we will be posting if there's a link or information that a speaker mentions. All attendees have their audio and video muted since this is a webinar, so the best way to get your questions or comments is through the Q&A or chat functions. We're also recording this, so mind your P's and Q's, because we'll be putting this up on YouTube later to reach a broader audience, and so all the partner organizations can share it with their followers. Again, this program is really part of the outreach program that all World Affairs Councils do with different partners to, especially in this time of the coronavirus pandemic, to talk about the impact, especially on some of the aspects that you may not have thought of. And we look to experts like Outright Action International who can illuminate that for us. If you're not already a member of a World Affairs Council in your local area, I encourage you to do that or renew, because that helps fund the programs like this. So again, thank you for joining us. I'm now going to pass it off to Jessica from the World Affairs Council of Seattle, who will be introducing our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek, and welcome again, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jessica Ciarone, and I'm the Program Officer for Community Programs of the World Affairs Council in Seattle. And I have the honor to introduce our panelists today. So without further ado, I guess, Jessica Stern is the Executive Director of Outright Action International, and she specializes in gender, sexuality, and human rights globally. At Outright, she has supported the legal registration of LGBTIQ organizations globally, helped secure the mandate of the United Nations Independent Experts on Discrimination and Violence based on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, and advanced the UN LGBTI core group. The second panelist of today is Luisa Drummond Video, and she is Outright Action International Program Officer. She is a Brazilian attorney and worked at the Rapporteurship on Rights of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex persons of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for almost 2 years. Luisa has also published several academic articles on sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. Nish McLean is the Caribbean Program Officer at Outright Action International and is based in Jamaica. Nish is the co-founder of Transwave Jamaica, Jamaica's first and only organization dedicated to advocacy for trans people. Nish is also the Vice Chair of the United Caribbean Trans Network. So Jessica, it's over to you.
Well, I like when one Jessica passes it to another Jessica. I think this is off to a great start. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that warm introduction. Thank you so much, Derek, for starting us off. In addition to Nish, Luisa, and me, we have our wonderful colleague, Katie Holtquist, who's our West Coast Director, who's a part of this call and is going to be helping us with the slideshow, along with possibly fielding questions. So I want to welcome you all to what we're calling Pride with a Purpose, responding to COVID-19 in LGBTIQ communities globally. And I just want to say happy Pride. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm speaking to you today from my home in Brooklyn. And I want to start by saying a very warm thanks to Derek and Jackie and the World Affairs Council of Oregon, the World Affairs Council of Seattle, The first World Affairs Council that I met was the World Affairs Council of Seattle, the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, and World Affairs Councils of America for hosting this program and giving us this opportunity to share our work with you. Nish and Louisa, I know that you were just introduced by Jessica, but let me just ask you, is Nish, starting with you, maybe pronouns and how you're feeling this Pride Month?
Thank you very much, Jessica and Jessica, for the warm introduction. So my name is Nish Reckley. My pronouns are he, him, they, them. And for me, for this Pride Month, I think the theme for today's webinar is great, Pride with a Purpose. I feel like I have a renewed purpose and commitment to ensuring that our communities are not left behind and that we provide a platform to amplify the experiences of our global LGBTIQ community. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Nish. Louisa.
Thank you, Jessica. And it's hard coming after a niche that says such beautiful words, but my pronouns are she, her. And for me, well, I'm just feeling that Pride with a Purpose is actually a really good way of saying things with everything that's happening, not only here in the US, but everywhere in the world. Right now, it's a time of change, it's a time to work together. And us as the LGBTIQ community, we have the opportunity to work together with other communities, with the anti-racism movement, with everything else to make Pride even more inclusive and better every year.
Wonderful. Thank you, Louisa. Before we get into our discussion, we wanted to start by building off of what Louisa just said and acknowledge that Pride Month is a time to remember the history of our movement, to commemorate our achievements and our creativity and our resilience as a community, and to push for social change. And in that context, we especially want to recognize the history of Pride as a protest led by trans women of color, and to state unequivocally that Outright International is committed to affirming Black lives and fighting against racial injustice, and white supremacy around the world and in ourselves. We believe there is no place for racism in the LGBTIQ community or anywhere else, and the fight for racial justice is an integral part of our movement for LGBTIQ human rights. So we're very grateful for the opportunity to share how our movements for justice and equality are linked here in the US with our global movement. So let me tell you a little about Outright. If you haven't encountered us before, we're going to be talking about the state of the world, how LGBTIQ people are experiencing the impact of COVID. But first I wanted to give you a general overview so you know what credibility Nish, Louisa, and I have for addressing you today. Well, we work for Outright International, which is a 30-year-old organization with a track record of defending and advancing LGBTIQ human rights globally. We have staff and offices in 8 countries, 2 in Asia, 2 in Europe, 2 in the Caribbean, 1 in East Africa, and our global headquarters are in New York, where we, in the Northern Hemisphere in North America, where we have several offices. And we work through 3 primary strategies. I'll talk about one of them and then I'll pass it on to Nish to talk about the next, and then Louisa the next. One of our main strategies that really motivates me, and now I'm revealing a lot about myself, it's our research program, because I love data. And why do I love data? Because when you're pushing for transformation, when you're trying to say the status quo isn't good enough, you need data to back up your arguments. And Outright specializes in a very particular kind of data. We try to answer what we consider to be big data questions, not just how LGBTIQ people are faring in one community or one country or one region, but we try to provide a global overview so that you can actually understand where can LGBTIQ organizations legally operate. Where are LGBTIQ people being most impacted by arbitrary arrest? And then we use that data to advocate for change. And it takes many forms. And if you're a data geek like me, please take a look at our website so you can find research that might speak to you as well. Nish, do you want to speak about one of our other core strategies?
Sure. So for me, as someone who's from the Caribbean, I'm very invested in resourcing our movement. And when I speak about movement resourcing, it's really linked directly to movement building, because we cannot build our movement without providing resources to our communities on the ground who are doing important work and often don't have the same leverage and platform as other groups that exist outside, in the global south. So one of the ways in which Outright does that, and in the Caribbean, I'll give two examples. One of our major projects in the Caribbean is our gender-based violence project. And as we go through this presentation, we see how directly linked some of the challenges that our community experiences are also linked to institutional, challenges with the state, and how there's a lack of opportunity and support for communities who experience violence. So our gender-based violence project, we work directly with our partners who we provide small grants to and partner with them to do very important work. And some of the countries that we're working in are the St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua and Barbuda, and Haiti. So movement resourcing and movement building is very important to Outright. One of our other major projects, and again, as Jessica spoke about the history of Pride and how Black trans women have been at the forefront of our movement. In the Caribbean setting in particular, we also see that our trans organizations are being left behind. They don't have the same resources as the LGBT movement, which are predominantly led in the Caribbean and focus mainly on issues experienced by gay and bisexual men. And so our Trans Caribbean project is providing a space and a platform for trans activists in the region to access spaces like the OAS, like the UN, and to ensure that gender identity recognition remains at the forefront of one of the things that we're fighting for in the region.
Thank you very much, Nish. Louisa.
Yes, so I got the last one, which also makes my life a lot easier because it makes a lot of sense that our third point is advocacy, because we gather all that very important data that I also am a data nerd, so I love it. And then we do the movement resourcing and we work with our partners on the ground and we try to move the needle there. But then we gather everything and we do our advocacy work to hold governments accountable, to try to move the needle forward, because we know that worldwide, LGBTI persons, there's not one single country that discrimination or violence does not happen. So it's very important to hold those governments accountable, to protect and to develop LGBTI rights, not only at the domestic level, but as Nish said, in the regional level, and as I do as a member of the UN team at the UN level. Outright has an ECOSOC status, so we do work at the UN headquarters here in New York City. And also we're the secretariat of something called the LGBTI, the United Nations LGBTI Core Group, which is a group of 32 countries and the EU delegation and the High Commissioner on Human Rights Watch, and Outright as the secretariat. You can also go for their website. I always like to say that and do a little bit. Please go Google that UN LGBTI Core Group to see a little bit more of the work that we do, which is also finding those allies to help us and be champions to push LGBTI issues internationally and to highlight everything else that we find in our research and our work on the ground as well.
Thank you so much, Louisa. And since Louisa and Nish did such amazing jobs talking about the two strategies that they addressed, I just want to add one more thing about research. You may be saying, I don't know, I see research by LGBTIQ organizations all the time. What can I find from Outright that's distinctive? One thing that I would mention is that because we have global reach, we also have a very large audience. So on average, we have about 1 billion people per year that use our research, that read it, that consume it. And so as the World Affairs Council is sort of thinking about, pressing issues of the day, please consider our research a resource to you. And I think that, especially in Pride Month, we think a lot about how LGBTIQ people have survived for so long under often traumatic circumstances. One of our recent reports is actually about the impact of conversion therapy, which unfortunately is not a practice that we have banished to the history books, but actually is a practice that still exists today, and only 4 countries globally ban it. So there's a lot to be said for these strategies. Let's move now on to one example of Outright's research, which comes in the context of COVID. So fairly early in the pandemic, we released a report, Vulnerability Amplified, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on LGBTIQ people. And you might be asking yourself, how did you get a report out so quickly? And what motivated you in the middle of a pandemic to undertake a major research initiative? And the truth is that Outright anticipated that there would be disparate impact on LGBTIQ people, even within the pandemic. We know that problems and inequalities that already exist are exacerbated in times of crisis. It's like pouring gasoline on the fire. All the problems you had before only become worse in times of scarcity and in times of panic. And we also knew that clear documentation of the disparate impact on LGBTIQ populations in real time was needed. The idea was to sound the alarm, not to wait for the crisis to hurt LGBTIQ people more, but to say, these are the warning signs. These are what community leaders are pointing out as problems that they're already seeing, and use that data to encourage governments and foundations and even journalists to report on, to address, and provide emergency interventions to mitigate harm, right? We know better than to think LGBTIQ people will necessarily benefit from all of the mainstream resources, because we know that homophobia and transphobia impact everything. And so even as we began reaching out, it was clear that globally, LGBTIQ people were already living on the razor's edge of poverty, and that the pandemic and the quarantines were pushing them further into crisis. And on top of that, we know that LGBTIQ movements in most countries around the world don't have 50-year histories. They're young movements led by young people. And so they don't have a rich reservoir of organizational reserves or diversified funding. So many LGBTIQ groups find themselves in danger of collapsing. And we know that in this context, government and traditional relief response is often focused on broad populations. And so LGBTIQ people are sometimes shut out or scapegoated, and in some cases, do not have access to or trust the institutions that are providing emergency relief efforts. So in this context, emergency support is absolutely critical. And in addition to providing this global research report, we developed an emergency fund, which provides grants to LGBTIQ organizations on the front lines of the crisis. We'll come back to that later. I guess what I want to say to you is, we think of the report and the emergency fund as complementary. We need data to influence government and funder priorities, and we need funding to get to those who need it, because this is a life or death situation. And beyond the research and the funding, Outright is working in partnership with the private sector through companies like Visa and other business networks, and with governments and other mechanisms like the LGBTI core group that Louisa mentioned, as well as with other organizations like the NGOs that Nish mentioned in the Caribbean, because we have to elevate the awareness of the situation and advocate for LGBTIQ inclusion in COVID relief and recovery efforts. So Katie, I think because I'm using my wonderful notes on my version of the presentation and I'm not looking at the slide, I'm just going to kind of toggle with you which I'm looking at so that our audience is looking at the same thing. So on my screen, I'm on slide 4, which shows figure 1, number of participants by region. This is just a quick glance for all of you to see that Outright's global research report really reached every region of the world to make sure that we got a very representative sample of community members telling us what they feared. And now I'm moving on to slide number 5, which summarizes our 7 key themes and findings from our report. So Ami Bishop, a Seattle-based researcher, advocate, wonk, and superhuman, led this research report. And what she did was she led a team of researchers and advocates. Actually, just about every person at Outright interviewed someone about the impact of COVID on the LGBTIQ community that they represent. And the impact was that we managed to speak with 60 LGBTIQ leaders from around the world, and they gave us a very clear picture of what fears they had for the community in the context of COVID. What were they? One, the devastation of livelihoods and rising food insecurity. It's exactly as I said, we were living on the razor's edge of poverty before, so of course, many people found themselves in crisis as soon as they were expected to shelter in place. Think about it. If you're a day laborer, if you work in the informal sector, you can't do your job from home. You have to be able to leave your home to generate an income. And if you were overrepresented among the working classes and those living in poverty before, the chance that you have some savings account that can sustain you for 3 months without income is unrealistic. And so the message that outright was given by our partners very early on was that people from our community were going hungry. The second theme that Ami and our team found was disruptions in healthcare, medication access, and reluctance to seek care. And I think this is twofold. These issues are twofold. So one is the reluctance to seek care. LGBTIQ people have a long history of being mistreated by the medical establishment. And in this environment where we're being told, talk to your doctors, go to the hospital, you're not going to go if you don't feel safe. And one of our interviewees said, I would have to be on death's door before I would go to the hospital, because to have my trans identity be erased is like a death sentence to me, right? And then of course, we also saw a hierarchy of medical needs where access to HIV drugs, access to hormone therapies were often considered secondary in the context of the pandemic. And in that context, you see people thrown into radical destabilization of their wellness. We also saw domestic violence increase. We saw mental health decrease. You can imagine if you're stuck with your homophobic or transphobic parents, how are you going to keep it together? Your family, your biological family, may be your abuser, and your queer family is your support system, but you can't go out. You can't see your support system. So people's mental health suffered. And there's one story that stands out for me that comes from our colleagues in St. Lucia, and they provide mental health services where people call in and they talk to a therapist. They told us that people were going into the closets of their home to call in for mental health services. They're literally going into the closet to talk to someone about how to survive the anxiety of being with their homophobic families. You can't make up a metaphor like that. And then you see also, we've been afraid of the scapegoating we've heard. What do governments and religious leaders do in times of crisis? Well, we know they don't like to take responsibility. They know they like to find someone to blame. And very often they blame us. Abuse of state power was another finding. And as I already mentioned, really desperate anxiety and fear about LGBTIQ organizations folding, because LGBTIQ organizations are of course dependent on donations to survive. And if governments are cutting back their human rights grants, or governments are saying, we're going to prioritize our populations, then grassroots organizations that don't have a domestic culture of philanthropy or don't have a lot of funding sources are not going to be able to pay the rent on their office, to pay their staff salaries. They're going to wonder whether they can keep running programs for their community at the exact moment where money is dropping and need is skyrocketing. Thank you for listening to the 7 themes. And now I'd like to ask you, Nish, to talk a little bit about some of the themes in greater detail.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jessica, for the lovely framing and really giving us a solid foundation to pivot to get a little bit more details and stories out of the various themes. And so for theme 1, I'm going to talk a little bit about devastation of livelihood and the increase in food insecurity. I want to talk a little bit in terms of that, just to give a framing. Jessica spoke a little bit about it, that or the very livelihood and survival of our LGBTIQ communities is pretty much dependent on job security. And with COVID, the sectors that are most impacted by COVID, particularly in the Caribbean region, are the sectors where LGBTIQ people are more than likely employed. I'm speaking about the tourism industry. I'm speaking here about, in terms of the industries such as even sex work as an industry, and also customer service and the arts. These are the fields in which LGBTIQ people earn a living. And with many businesses shuttered because of COVID, it means that LGBTIQ people are unable to buy basic things such as food. What we have seen in the research as well is that LGBTIQ individuals have to make a difficult decision about how to use their limited resources, to make a decision about either purchasing food or purchasing protective gear to combat COVID. And these are decisions that we should not have to make. Many of us don't have to make those decisions, and certainly LGBTIQ people shouldn't have to make those difficult decisions as well. Additionally, one of the things that we also see, and Jessica spoke about that, the distribution points. What we see is that the institutions providing emergency support are the ones who perpetuate stigma and violence against LGBTIQ people. And one of our colleagues interviewed someone in Asia, and they spoke about the fact that the church is a distribution point and the police station is a distribution point. And it's very similar in the Caribbean context as well. And so to ask of LGBTIQ people to go to these distribution centers for aid is insurmountable. It's really an act of violence. And therefore, the research shows that even though there is food availability, it does not equate to access. And so this is what we're talking about. How do LGBTIQ people access food and secure their own livelihood in instances where their very existence is treated as, as an issue for state and governments? So that's the first one that I really want to raise. And this also ties directly to the second theme that I'll speak about in terms of access. And this is regarding disruptions in healthcare access and the reluctance to seek care. Again, lovely framing by Jessica to raise the challenges, particularly of trans people and for persons who are living with HIV, with the already difficult circumstances that they face when we're looking at access to healthcare. And so, again, this also ties to the devastation of livelihood, because oftentimes for LGBTIQ people to access healthcare, they have to take public transportation. They have to use their resources. Access to trans-affirming healthcare is not covered by the state in many of our regions, and therefore LGBTIQ people and trans persons in particular have to use resources out of their own pocket. So without a job, without a stable home environment, it therefore means that the disruption in healthcare access is further exacerbated and exposed as a critical issue for LGBTIQ people across the world. And one of the things I want to mention specifically as an example, I interviewed one of my colleagues from the Cayman Islands, and as a trans woman, she shared the destabilization of her own healthcare because of COVID. She was running out of her trans-affirming medication and didn't have the resources to go and get them. Like Jessica said, the government and states don't see that, all of the different ways in which we live and experience life can all be met at the same time. We don't have to elevate COVID as a separate issue to the other issues that LGBTIQ people are experiencing. So access to healthcare, access to gender-affirming care and HIV medication, and access to COVID support and relief are all tied intricately together for LGBTIQ people. With that being said, I want to give space for us to have questions at the end as well. I'm going to turn over to my lovely colleague, Louisa, who will talk a little bit about state abuse of power and some of the other themes. Thank you.
Thank you, Nish. So continuing on the thematics of things that we found out in our report and our interviews is the abuse of state power. Because of the rhetoric of COVID and the war against COVID, we see a lot of the states having kind of specific measures that wouldn't be used in a normal sense. So we have emergency measures being put all over the world, but some of them are an opportunity for certain states to abuse their state power. We have certain examples of militarization, as for instance in South Africa and Kenya, as we all know that when the excessive police action happens, certain groups are overly attacked and are overly put into prison. And one of those examples that we can give very clearly to LGBTI persons is a shelter that was raided in Uganda, and they took 19 people to jail because allegedly they were not complying with the measures for COVID-19. It also does happen that all those 19 people were perceived as part of the LGBTI community. So that shows exactly how the states are using those states of emergency and the COVID response as a way to attack certain groups, which go together with scapegoating of LGBTI persons and showing a lot of what those governments are LGBTI phobic. And another clear example is Hungary, who tried to pass a law to end legal recognition of transgender and intersex persons during a pandemic. We do not know what is related with the pandemic and ending gender recognition, but they used that opportunity of a state of emergency to move a lot quicker. And even when it comes to good ideas on paper that do not look like discriminatory ideas, they can be very harmful to LGBTI persons, as for instance, what happened in Panama, Colombia, and Peru, that they passed a COVID resolution that men could go out in certain days and women could go out in other days. Some of those countries, like Panama, do not have gender recognition laws, so they arrested trans women who would go out on women's days, and non-binary people could not go to the streets. So we see that even in those places that there was not a shown idea of abuse of state power, there's also LGBTI persons falling through the cracks of the state protection. And if we pass to the next theme and last theme, the concerns about organization survival, as Jessica said, clearly we all know that we are going through a crisis, and it's going to be an economic crisis because of COVID-19. But that also affects deeply the LGBTI organizations who already did not have a lot of funds and did magic on finding a new community, new spaces, and addressing all the issues that LGBTI people have, even though not having really big funds. And now with COVID and the COVID response, we know that the funds are shifting towards COVID and health response and rebuilding those countries and going back to, quote unquote, the new normal. So a lot of LGBTI organizations are very worried about their own survival because they know that they cannot work right now. They cannot be the space that people would meet physically. And they also cannot fulfill their projects and their goals that they had with their donors because all of them consisted of meeting in person with other people, which is not possible in most places of the world right now. So we're very worried that community building that has been happening in the past years is not only going to be hit really hard and lose a lot of momentum, but also that those organizations will not be able to continue existing, continuing offering the services that they offer, and we'll create a new hole in the LGBTI community and those spaces. And if we can move to, thank you. So those are, you can see just a couple of our recommendations. I would highly recommend you all to go to Outright's website and at least checking out the executive summary just to get a taste of it. And then if you're like us, the weekend, you have time to read the full report. Those are a couple of recommendations that I find are very important to go through, that we had recommendations to donors because of what I just said. It's important that donors are very flexible, that they increase the support, because we know the LGBTI communities are suffering and they're not going to be included in those general money and general grants that are going to come out in response to COVID. It's very important that when humanitarian organizations are doing the response, and we know that a lot of them are religious organizations, as Nish said, it's important that they will not include LGBTIQ persons usually. So it's important that you have other kinds of organizations and that you work directly with LGBTIQ partners so that reaches those people. And when it comes to governments, the United Nations and all the humanitarian agencies, it's so important that LGBTI persons are involved in everything, from the creation to the implementation of responses to any kind of pandemic, but right now in COVID response. It's important to address the food shortages. Like Nish said, no one should be choosing between protective gear and food. Everyone should have access to food. It's very important that they condemn the anti-LGBTI hate speech and scapegoating, because that only makes LGBTI people more vulnerable within the pandemic, and that the law enforcement agencies provide inclusive and appropriate and sensitive services. Because as I said, even when it looks like they're doing those kinds of services, a lot of the times that's not what's happening. So I'd love to pass the word to the beautiful Jessica again.
There's just so much love on this panel today. I just really want to appreciate it. Oh, well, thank you, Louisa. I did do my hair for you today. And I'm just looking at the clock and I'm thinking we want to have time for Q&A. So we'll try to get through the next set of slides in about 10 minutes or so then we can open it up to you. And let me also just invite you all to post questions in the Q&A as we go. Someone named Kellen Horde has posted a question. Thank you, Kellen, for being the brave first person. And you said, how do government approaches towards LGBTIQ people during COVID vary depending upon developed/developing status, if at all? Great question. Let me invite Nish and Louisa and Katie to respond if you have an answer at this time. And if not, we'll come back to it in the Q&A, but please continue to type your questions there. And what we'll try to do is we'll answer as we go, and then we'll also answer some when we come back to plenary with all of you. Okay, so as we mentioned, we created a COVID emergency funds specifically for LGBTIQ organizations doing grassroots work around the world. And as you could hear from Nisha and Louisa, we did this because we knew there would be huge need, but we also knew that traditional forms of governments and even NGO relief efforts don't take LGBTIQ people into account. And you know, we're fighting for a different world. We want that to change. We want everyone to be able to get equal access to services and food everywhere, but that's just not the case. And so in a pandemic, we work the world as it is rather than as it should be. And that meant distributing money to the trusted partners and resources of LGBTIQ people, the organizations that they already have relationships with. And so far, we have raised over $850,000. You could just clap in your seats. I'm clapping, I'm cheering. That is a very, very big amount of money. And one of the things that makes it so special is that we didn't raise it all in one fell swoop. We raised it from over 200 companies, foundations, and individuals, including Microsoft, Calvin Klein, Open Society Foundations. My mom, my dad, they're not together and they never agree on anything, but they both gave. Just a lot of people made a huge effort to make this possible. And just to help you understand how the fund was received, we issued the call for applications on April 8th, and within 3 weeks, we received 1,500 applications from 141 countries. This is a shocking amount of need. And it really underscores what we're saying, which is that LGBTIQ organizations found immediate urgent need right away. And I'm happy to say that we raised $850,000, but I'm unhappy to tell you that the total sum that groups asked us for totaled $12 million in appeals. And that means there's a huge gap. There are a lot of organizations doing excellent work for individuals and communities in crisis that we haven't been able to fund. And I just want to further politicize this for you a little bit and tell you that if you ask most private foundations right now, they're doing something that's very good, which is they're sticking with their existing grantees, which is what we want. But it means that if you're an organization that didn't already have your foot in the door and you didn't already have robust and diversified funding, or if you only had one donor and that donor has fallen into crisis because of COVID, then you're out of luck. which is what makes this fund so important, and which also means that we're continuing to fundraise at least through the month of June, because we have another $11+ million in appeals that we'd really love to meet. And if I haven't said, the highest region, the highest number of applications by region came from Africa. The next largest number of applications was from Latin America and then Asia, and sort of going in descending order from there. And the grants raised range from $2,500 to $10,000. And Katie, on my version that I'm using, I'm now on slide 12, the applications. This is really a slide that you should look at. There's two pie charts here. The pie chart that keeps me up at night is the one on the left. And what the one on the left shows you is that 57% of the appeals that came to outright were for food support. And I want to be really clear to you, other needs came in as well: health, organizational support, COVID supplies, shelter. But Outright is a human rights organization. We are not an organization that specializes in hunger and homelessness, yet 57% of the applications were for food relief. And that means that from the first moments of this crisis, LGBTIQ people were worried about their basic survival. On the pie chart on the right, I want to say the overwhelming number of applications that came in were from LGBTIQ groups. But when you look at the sort of more specific populations that applied for funds, trans organizations are terribly overrepresented. And that is a very clear reflection of the amount of exclusion and labor market discrimination that trans communities face, right? They were some of the most hard hit from day one. I'm moving on to the next slide. Just a little summary of our first round of grantees. Some really wonderful groups. You can just sort of eyeball their names. There's an organization that I learned about through this process called the Bar Hostess Empowerment Program. They're amazing. They're a community of workers that work primarily in bars and in Kenya. And they said when COVID hit, 90% of their membership lost their jobs overnight. So we gave them funding to pay for rent and food and sanitary supplies to just keep folks going. Luisa, do you want to tell us about an example of one of our grantees from Peru?
Yeah, and it's very timely with the question that Kristen Snyder asked about the intersectionality between being an immigrant and being an LGBTIQ person. Because El Instituto Político para la Libertad is a group in Peru that is one of our grantees that did like food packages. And those food packages went to houses for trans persons and mostly trans women that already lived in Peru. And as you might remember what I just said, Peru also had that issue of having men days and women's days, which is very complicated for them to get food. And within that group of women, they also had a group of 20 Venezuelan women who were immigrants in Peru. So even if they had the possibility to get their documentation, they couldn't because they were Venezuelan staying in Peru. So it was a really beautiful work of going to those 9 trans homes. It was over 200 people to get access to food and to gear protection and not having to go in the streets and being scared of what would happen to them. Just by being themselves and going to buy food. So for me, that's something that impacted me a lot.
Thank you, Luisa. Nish, do you want to talk about our partner in St. Lucia?
Sure. And so it just goes to also show though the link between the research and the link with our emergency fund. Because I remember speaking with Millie, who is from United and Strong in St. Lucia. And for Millie, when we did the interview, Millie shared that she felt helpless. She didn't know how to respond to the crisis that was happening. Her organization was impacted by COVID, and she wasn't thinking in that moment about herself. She was thinking about her LGBTIQ communities in St. Lucia. And so Millie shared that the pandemic for her reinforced the magnitude and pure beauty of humility. And she was inspired in the midst that there was this kindness and kindred spirit that was extended through Outright, because we all shared a goal to provide support and assistance to our communities who were negatively impacted by COVID. And I was really moved by Millie's own humility and the ways in which we were able to work together to support the community in St. Lucia. And it also shows the intersecting ways in which our partnership works and extends. And one of the things that Millie also pointed out was that when she was looking to provide support to our community in St. Lucia, she recognized that the emergency aid was going to specific groups. And unfortunately, LGBTIQ people were not considered vulnerable groups. We were not seen for our intersecting vulnerabilities as people who are also living with HIV, as people with disabilities, and so I think the way that we were able to come together through the emergency grant to provide urgent and critical support was really life-saving for many of our groups and communities across the world that we were able to support.
Thank you for that example, Nish. And let me just appreciate Kristen Snyder, who's also posed a question. Thank you, Kristen. We're gonna just go through this last slide, and then we're gonna turn to the questions. So if anybody else has comments, a question, a hope, please feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to it momentarily. So we wanna return to where we started. And the theme is Pride with a Purpose. Let's make the most of this time and let's take action together. Here are a few things that you can do to help. Really simple. Help us share our report. Demystify the ways that LGBTIQ people are affected. Dispel the myth that we're all impacted the same way. We have the data. Let's get it out to the broadest audience possible. That's part of why we're partnering with the World Affairs Council today. We're briefing audiences from NGO to government to foundations to journalists, just trying to get the analysis out there. The data is valuable. Its dissemination is invaluable. It does no good on the shelf. The second thing is support us and help share our emergency fund with your networks. As I mentioned, we raised about $850,000, which is amazing. We have over $11 million in appeals that we would still really love to fund. And at a minimum, we're taking contributions to the emergency fund at least through the end of June. So please contact us if you're interested, or if you just have that aunt who's been waiting to do something nice for you, or that neighbor who did something terrible and owes you one, encourage them to make a contribution. A lot of people want to do something good and something concrete during Pride Month. Here's an opportunity. Third opportunity is join a webinar. Nish and Louisa and Katie and our colleagues and I, we're talking with LGBTIQ leaders, some of the best and brightest from around the world, on a weekly basis about the issues that are important in their communities. So please join us. It's an open space, it's a confidential space, and we really invite you to dialogue with us. We also created something called Outright TV. That really makes it sound glamorous, don't you think, Nish? But it's not glamorous. There's no one who comes in and does our makeup or gives us special lighting. It's just us interviewing some of the smartest people that we know who are doing work to serve LGBTIQ communities. And I'm trying to think of some of the people that I've interviewed who've been amazing. I interviewed a colleague, Carlos Quesada, who works on racial justice in Latin America, and he talked about the intersections between racial justice and LGBTIQ rights in the context of COVID. And then, I really took one for the team, and I interviewed Karamo Brown from Queer Eye. So some of the interviews are really substantive with leading activists, and some of them are with extraordinary celebrities that actually understand the value of doing social justice movement-based work. And then last but not least, follow us on social media at Outright International. And our colleague Katie has very generously posted her email address there, which must mean that she trusts all of you to write to her personally. So only send nice notes to Katie, please. And I also especially want to thank Katie for putting this presentation together today. Thank you, Katie. She is the blonde person in front of the blue wall. And so with that, we're going to open it for Q&A. I see we got a third question from Mar Brasted-Maki. Thank you very much. And let me just ask a procedural question of Derek and Jessica, Nathan and Tim. Do you exclusively take questions through the Q&A, or do we also unmute people's mics so that they can ask questions out loud? How do you guys usually do that?
Jessica, this is Tim DeRoche from WorldOregon. We generally take them through the Q&A function because it allows us to keep the flow going and sort of vet as we go. If you would like to read them like as you've been doing, you can do that. Otherwise, I'm happy to offer my disembodied voice for you, but you're doing a great job. So.
Well, I happen to have seen your face before the webinar started, so I can attest, not totally disembodied. Okay, Tim, I'm happy to read them out. Thank you for that. Okay, we have 3 questions. I read out Kellen's question, and let me read out Kristen's question. So Kristen Snyder asks, how are these issues exacerbated by the additional challenge of being an immigrant LGBTIQ member outside of your native country? And just outright provide additional services for these people that carry yet another level of discrimination? Excellent question, Kristen. And Mar asked, how many of the organizations you support are specifically targeted towards LGBTQ2IA+ youth? Okay, thank you very much for that question, Mar. Let's see, I'm getting a message from Nish, who's volunteering to reply to Kristen's question. Thanks, Nish.
Sure, thank you for all the questions. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about in the context of the emergency fund as well. So we do acknowledge and note that there are like different intersecting challenges that LGBTIQ people will experience, and those who are living outside their native country. So I just wanted to raise like an example out of Haiti, where there's a current political and social instability in Haiti. And so we were already supporting, and this is again, we talk about resource movement building and resourcing our movements, or existing projects allow us to already know what's happening in countries around the globe. So for Haiti, our partner in our gender-based violence project, we already had a situation where some of our partners had to flee Haiti to the Dominican Republic. And so when they also saw the grant opportunity and they applied for the grant, we gave that special consideration, considering the challenges that our grantee partners were already experiencing and had to leave Haiti. So one of the other things that we also do is, knowing already that immigrants and refugees have difficult circumstances, we also did partner with the Rainbow Railroad as another entity who was supporting and giving resources through the emergency fund. So partnership and recognizing the challenges and using our expertise and our connections with community and organizations supporting is some of the ways in which we are able to support immigrants living outside of their native country.
Thank you so much, Nish. And let me just add to what Nish said about Rainbow Railroad. One of the really nice things about the COVID fund is we've sought to partner with organizations with very specific and targeted expertise. So Rainbow Railroad made a contribution to the emergency funds, but they did more than offer money. They also offered expertise. So their staff joined the grants review panel, and they specifically reviewed all applications that had to do with immigration and migration, along with Outright's own staff. And it was just, I want to lift that up because it was such a great example, as you said, Nish, of partnership, right? Because LGBTIQ immigrants, as I think you're saying, Kristen, experience multiple forms and intersecting forms of discrimination. So we have to make sure that people get the support they need. All right, Louisa, would you like to answer Kellen's question? I suspect our UN program officer might be quite passionate about this.
Yes, Callan, this is a very interesting question, and honestly, in the beginning, LGBTIQ people fell on the cracks for everyone's response, from high income, middle income, low income countries. LGBTI people were not their priority when starting responding to COVID, and this is like one of the reasons why Outright was so fast to start doing the research and having data on those issues, because we did not see a lot of people talking about it. And of course, there are certain countries that already have a history of protecting LGBTI rights, which is not necessarily just the so-called high incomes or developed countries. So we do have a lot of partners in the European Union, and we do have a lot of countries that do already have policies, but we also have countries like, for instance, in the Latin American group, they are part of our LGBTI core group that already have a lot of policies and ways of dealing with LGBTIQ issues within their own policies and their domestic work, as well as internationally, that includes LGBTI persons. And it's also a lot easier to reach out to them because we already work with them here at the UN, but also on Capitol or in the regional systems, and it's easier to remind them, which shouldn't be a necessity, to remind them that LGBTIQ people should be included in their COVID responses. But we are, and we kept doing it, and we shared our research with them. And although all of them do fall into the cracks in the first beginning, we start to see certain responses, mostly from our partner countries, who are not necessarily the division, like you said, developed and developing country, but countries that already had a friendly and a champion relationship towards LGBTI rights and issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Louisa. That was great. And I would say that when I look at the world right now, I'm sort of categorizing it into LGBTIQ friendly countries, explicitly homophobic and transphobic countries, and then swing states. And I would say the countries that were bad before the pandemic are terrible now, right? So I think Louisa gave the example of Hungary. And you just have to sort of stop and pause. But like in the middle of the pandemic, the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, decided one of the important policy priorities was removing the ability of transgender people to change their birth certificates. Why? I cannot imagine from a governance perspective why that was a top priority amid a pandemic, other than political distraction and opportunism. So the countries that were bad before, the governments that were bad before, are bad now. One of our issues is that the countries that should know better, that have good laws and policies on LGBTIQ rights, really just aren't doing enough. And that's because, frankly, there's not a rich or long history of LGBTIQ rights being a part of the discourse around humanitarian programming. And so we're learning as we go how to support humanitarian work, and we're asking governments not to give grant funding to humanitarian organizations that won't commit to the principle of non-discrimination. Because actually, we see some governments, including friendly governments, saying, rah, rah, LGBTIQ rights on the one hand, but then they have no non-discrimination clauses in their grant agreements. So that's a huge problem. Let me move to Mar's question. Mar, I have to tell you, you've got like the whole of Outright staff trying to add up the number of how many queer youth were the recipients of our COVID funds. I have one person who's looking right now. Oh, I'm getting the little dots on my phone. Okay, the answer among those grants that we've awarded so far, and I think we've awarded, Katie, you actually had a number, so I'm thinking you looked it up. How many?
60.
Okay,
60 so far.
We've awarded around 60 grants so far. We're about to do another tranche, and it looks like we've done about 6 grants so far for LGBTIQ plus youth, which is good, which is a start. It's not the end, but it is a start. I think funding LGBTIQ youth initiatives is especially important because we know how many queer youth are stuck with their families right now, right, where they're not safe. So we do need to be able to reach them in carefully tailored ways. Mar, you're welcome. I'm glad we could get you an answer. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in, and I don't want anyone to feel shy. Nish and Louisa are nowhere near as intimidating as they look. Derek, should I wrap it up, or well, how would you like us to proceed?
I think we probably should wrap it up. We've reached the hour, and it's been a fantastic conversation. So unless there's any closing comments that one of the panelists wanted to make, I can wrap us up.
Beautiful. I thought that we were supposed to fill 15 more minutes to make you happy, but in that case, we answered all of our questions. I guess I would just say on behalf of Outright, thank you so much to the World Affairs Council for creating this space. We really appreciate it. And we just reiterate that in this Pride Month, we should all take up the mantle of recognizing that there are no LGBTIQ rights without racial justice, and there are no LGBTIQ rights until all of us are free. Thank you very much, and over to you, Derek.
Well said, Jessica. And as we were talking before the program, and just to our incredible supportive audience of World Affairs Council's members from around the country, now's the time you can be supporting multiple nonprofits working in various areas of social justice and dialogue and peaceful interaction. So I encourage you to do that in whichever community you're in. Thank you for joining for this special event during Pride Month. And we will be putting this up on YouTube later, so I encourage you to share this out as well. Check out the links. If you didn't already, copy the link here in the chat for some of the reports from Outright Action International. And again, thank you all for joining us on behalf of World Affairs Council of Seattle, World Oregon, and the World Affairs Councils of America, and all our partners, including World Pittsburgh. We thank you for joining us, and we wish you a safe and happy day.
Bye, everyone.